Okay, so in the last presentation, we looked at living more simply, consuming more responsibly, giving more generously, and connecting with the poor as things we might do to help those in global poverty. This time, we want to look at the last of those recommendations, that we demand that our politicians make global poverty a priority in the public policy of the United States. I am largely here reflecting the viewpoints of faith-based or church-based advocacy groups. They generally recommend more development aid for poor countries, better development aid, the cancellation of the debts that poor countries owe to international banking institutions, and trade policies that emphasize fair trade rather than free trade. We will look at each of these recommendations in this presentation. In the 1970s, the wealthy nations of the world, mostly the United States and Western Europe, pledged to provide 0.7% of their gross national products to development assistance. Many critics point out that that goal has never been reached. Instead of 0.7%, the amount historically has been closer to being around 0.2 or 0.4%. That means hundreds of billions of dollars less than was originally pledged. And you might be surprised to know that though the United States is the largest provider of development aid or development assistance to poor countries in terms of the gross number of dollars, we are actually the lowest among the industrialized wealthy nations as a percentage of our gross national product. Of course, it's not just that faith-based advocacy groups believe that the United States should give a much greater amount for developmental assistance. They believe that aid could be better. In fact, developmental aid is often of very dubious quality. It's often designed to benefit domestic interest groups, making it inefficient in terms of actually raising the standard of living of those in poor countries. So, for example, much of our foreign aid is actually packaged within the agricultural bill, which is designed to help agricultural interests, industrial farmers in the United States. Aid is often targeted in those areas where we have great strategic and economic interests, rather than being targeted to those countries who need aid most. So, for example, Israel and Egypt are large recipients of American developmental assistance as a part of the Camp David Accord that brought peace between those two countries several decades ago. And all too often, aid comes with strings attached that require the recipient country to buy goods and services from us, from the donor country, at our prices, when they could use that money much more effectively to purchase goods and services within their own country or from other providers that could provide it more cheaply. But again, you see, this requirement is serving our domestic interests rather than the interests of those who are poor. So this is what the critics of the quality of our foreign aid are advocating. Let's target those countries that most need development assistance rather than those countries that simply serve our own strategic and economic interests. Let's design our aid to serve the interests of the poorest in those countries rather than the interest of the donor countries in our own interests and powerful domestic interests within the United States, like our industrial farmers. And let's remove the requirement, let's remove the strings attached to that foreign aid that often requires the recipient country to purchase goods and services from us. Often this means that they're required to purchase items that technologically don't reflect their needs. Let's say they're required to buy large tractors from John Deere in the United States, rather than purchasing technology more appropriate to the farming in their countries. Many poor countries are experiencing a significant debt crisis. Those governments in the developing world are deeply in debt to private banks and to public financial institutions like the World Bank or the IMF. This means that their tax revenues flow towards paying off those debts rather than being directed towards the building of schools or infrastructure and social services within their own countries. Many of the advocates of debt cancellation point out that this debt crisis arose many decades ago in the 1960s and 70s when a reduction in the value of the dollar caused a sharp rise in oil prices, and huge profits in the oil industry were deposited into Western banks. That glut of money forced interest rates down and undermined those banks' ability to make a profit loaning money. So they came up with the idea of loaning large amounts of money to governments in the poor part of the world with little concern about whether those poor countries would be able to repay those loans, or assuming that they would be able to repay those loans. Poor countries were then pressured by wealthier ones to borrow large amounts of money to develop their own economies, but particularly to develop them in ways that would turn their economies into exporters of goods and services and raw materials that were needed in the global economy. But projects that weren't necessarily aimed at the true interests of the poor in those countries. So, according to one proponent of debt cancellation, in the end, little of the money borrowed benefited the poor. Across the range, about a fifth of it went on arms, often to shore up repressive regimes. Many governments started large-scale development projects, some of which proved of little value. All too often, the money found its way into private bank accounts. The poor were the losers. So why should the large international banking institutions like the IMF and the World Bank simply cancel or forgive the debts that poor countries owe to them? Well, the advocates of this say that those debts, in fact, have already been paid for. That, in fact, the poor countries have been able to pay back the principal that they were originally loaned. It's just the escalating payments for interest that they have been unable to repay. Secondly, they have said that the strings attached to some debt relief proposals have simply resulted in new loans that burden the poor and the forcing of trade policies on poor countries that haven't served the interest of the poor people there. Moreover, they point out that current debtors don't actually owe these debts. Those debts were often made in bad faith to older oppressive governments that now have been replaced by more democratic governments who are trying to serve the interests of their citizens. The debt cancellation advocates will also point to the Bible and to its idea of debt forgiveness as a part of the Jubilee year. You remember about that. Indeed, the campaign internationally for debt cancellation is often called the Jubilee campaign, specifically referencing that biblical idea. And finally, they point out that debt cancellation has produced positive results. And that's just common sense that it would. If poor countries are able to use their tax revenues to develop infrastructure and public housing and public health, rather than pay off the banks in the wealthy part of the world, that will surely produce incredible benefits for poor people in those countries. So in this short presentation, we've looked at the idea of more development aid, better development aid, and debt cancellation. In the next presentation, we'll look at the debate about trade policy and the advocacy for fair trade rather than free trade.